Well, the sun's out here today at Kahungunu Event Centre, and there's the Wairarapa Walking Festival on with a host of speakers. People have come to hear about the range of daily walks across the Wairarapa to suit all ages and walking abilities from the 10th to the 19th of November. To introduce the Māori explorers who travelled to Whenua and where people will be walking is storyteller Ra Smith, Ngāti Kahungunu ki Wairarapa.
Kia ora koutou. And the program I'm put down as a hautatu. And a hautatu in Māori is somebody who's mischievous. And Maui is an example of a hautatu. And a pōtiki in my whānau, or the youngest of my whānau, is my sister Marama. And if anyone knows her, you know there's a hautatu right there. Being a hautatu though, is one of the things is that you kind of wander off the accepted path and explore and find different things. So when I went to school in Martinborough Primary, I found it really hard to get to school, even though my dad was a teacher. I would be discovering things along the way, and I always thought that that was the purpose of school, as opposed to writing lines after I got there late. Some people I see recognise that punishment. In terms of Māori and some of the walks that here, as with most things Māori, we start with the atua and think about the whakapapa there. And so there's a ara called Te Ara Pautama. And Te Ara Pautama is Tāne's descent, his walk up into the highest heaven. And often the story gets told about Tāne, but it doesn't get told about the person he was competing with, a man named Whiro, or an atua named Whiro. Whiro was an older brother, and I don't know if you've got any older brothers. Thankfully I'm the oldest son. I'm the oldest grandchild to two grandparents, so it was looking down at others. And if you've been a younger a sibling, then you know what that looking down on is not really very nice. Whiro was one of the older brothers, and Tāne was one of the very youngest of brothers. And so Whiro got really, how can we say, jealous. And so there's two types of ara in terms of going to the Pautama. And one is Te Ara o Tāne, and that was the true or tūturu way of getting to the highest heaven. And then there was Te Ara o Whiro, which was the kind of cheating way to try and pass Tāne so he could get to the highest heaven before Tāne. And so I don't know if you've ever walked with people who you like to cheat on the walk. Might have a car parked somewhere close and try and take care of that invention. One of the things that happened was that Tāne's climb to the highest heaven meant that he got the 3 baskets of knowledge. And the 3 baskets of knowledge he brought back down. And sometimes you see a Pautama like a stairway to heaven going up uphill, and there's the idea that you're just coming back down that stairway, but actually on one side is a stairway up, and on the other side there's normally a stairway down, just so that we don't get too close to Led Zeppelin and think about and think a little more about the Mayan temples. And it was that kind of shape that the stairway was there. So one thing that's often lost is that in the story is that there was a goddess named, and right now people might be going, goddess, man, I hear about 71 Māori atua and they're all males. Who are these goddesses? Well, there was quite a few goddesses as well. And usually what happens is in a male-dominated society, they only care about males anyway. This woman, her name is Hine Kauorohia. And Hine Kauorohia let the first rains come onto the earth as Tāne was climbing to the highest heavens. That cleansed him so that when he got the pieces of knowledge, then he could descend to the earth with those knowledges and use them rightly. There's just a small kind of window into the travelling that Māori now can set their minds to. So even here in Wairarapa, we had some things called te ara tawhito and a te ara kiore. So a te ara tawhito is an old track that people would use. And so where our marae is at Huruniuarangi, we're around rivers that come from 5 different directions. One that we all know for going from north to south is Ruamahanga, but the one that people might not think about is going south to north, and there's not many rivers in Wairarapa that do go south to north, and that was the stream called Mākahakaha. And then there's one that comes from the northeast, coming south, and that's the Tauiru. And so where the Tauiru and Ruamahanga come together, that's where Huruniuarangi is. And then there's a river that comes from the west coming east, and that's called the Waikoko. And then there's a river coming from the east, coming to the west, or a stream, and that's Kauraro, means hundreds of crayfish. That's the name of the dam in the lake. And Kauratahi, meaning one crayfish, so you know where to go fishing there. And Kauratahi is where the stream is, with just one kaura. Right there where the flooding area was, a whole range of people, normally when they walked, came up the waterways. So if your enemy came up the waterways and you could see them, then you had a defensive position. And instead of covering the defensive positions on the river, we went straight up the hill to Kauraro. Then once you get to Kauraro, if you just go down the other side, you can get to another river called Wainuaru. Take the Wainuaru out to Pahawa, and then Pahawa to the coast. And hopefully, if the people are still chasing you then, hopefully there's a good wind so you can start sailing your waka there. And so that's a tawhito, te ara tawhito, a defensive track. And then there's te ara kiore. And so one of the things Polynesians brought with them is the rat. And it was a Polynesian rat, unlike the Norwegian one that's mainly survived. And the Polynesian rat, if you walked along a track enough, would follow the track rather than follow the walking track. So Māori would do that because one of the things that you could do is then set your traps near the walking tracks, because that's where you'd hopefully find kiore. But one of the things about the food pyramid was that birds then started hunting rats. And birds hunting rats then, that's another good place for people who are hunting. And so here in the middle of the island, or in the middle of the lands, we would go out to the coast, and the people on the coast would come inland, and so there was a walking track that went along there. I'm going to close with this kōrero because it's one that applies to some taniwha. Usually when I say taniwha, I look around the room and watch people who are holding the steer or steering away, or going, what the heck is this guy going on about? But I do want to say that the taniwha, in terms of our tracks, if I compared that in a co-governance way, there's not a good word to say, but in a co-governance way to dragons, you know that we've got the sign of the dragon in our flag. It's called the St. George Cross. Remember what St. George did to become famous? Yeah, that's right, he caught a dragon. Last time you saw a dragon? Might be the last time I saw a taniwha. Anyway, the taniwha is up at Kauraro, and one taniwha called Ngāti Huaro was missing its sister. And the sister was named Parakuiti. The cliffs outside of the Ngāti, and if anyone's here from the Ngāti, can I please get some money for free advertising? But just out of the Ngāti there, the cliffs are called Parakuiti, named after the taniwha. And Ngāti Huaro was missing his sister, and so decided to come looking for her from Waimarama. And he got down to Pahawa and was sniffing upstream, and thought that he smelt the scent of the Parakuiti, and so that he travelled inland. As he was travelling inland, our kōrero is that our people were travelling out to the sea. because we were going out to a taupahi, and taupahi seasonal fishing grounds. And so we were going out to the seasonal fishing grounds, and our first people who went out there to see if everything was right came across the taniwha. And so the taniwha, in some people's terms, ate or killed the people coming out. And so after a while, when there was no return of people coming back from the coast, they sent up a man named Tūpurupuru. And Tūpurupuru spotted from up the top of the hill the taniwha. And so he set a trap for the taniwha. And the trap that he set was a little yapping dog. And as he set the dog into a cave, the taniwha got curious about what was this making all this noise. And so he came down, and as he looked into the cave, the dog pulled back, and then all of a sudden shot out and surprised the taniwha, which kind of stepped backwards, and almost as I did today, fell over. And as he fell over, the trees that had already been cut in half collapsed on him. And those there, Tūpurupuru killed the taniwha, Ngāti Rahuara. And now our maunga raki, is the body of their taniwha. Hopefully, as you come into this walking festival, you won't come across a taniwha, and that you will be able to walk. But I will take the health and safety message to everyone. Please, if you need to stop and have a drink of water, let people know, and we'll stop. One year we had a difficult accident because somebody didn't stop and collapsed on our walkway. The most important thing about our walking is about health, and so please don't run into a taniwha. Kia ora koutou.
Make sure I don't speed up the steps too much, because they'd be Russian steps if I did that. That was especially for Ra and I known each other a long time and try to out-pun each other basically. So, kia ora tātou, it's lovely to be here. When I think about walking, I think back to a particular incident that happened maybe 20 years ago down at Mātakitaki Kupe, Cape Palliser, where Ngāti Hene Waka were building what became the wharepuni that's now in Te Papa. They were also creating some gardens down there, so I was able to, I guess, provide two sets of help down there, helping with some of the history and recording what was happening there, plus also helping advise on how we could set up traditional gardens down there. And one day, not unlike this actually, a beautiful day, Niniwa Munro took me for a walk up to Orangi Kōrero, which was the name of an ancient par site. So we were staying in the lighthouse house where the lighthouse keeper had once lived. And we walked, probably spent a couple of hours walking actually up to this old par site and walking back slowly. But during the walk, what she told me, and what I've remembered ever since whenever I walk, is that if you want to know a place, you have to walk it. And the stories from the soil will come up through your feet, and you'll learn what has happened, and you'll feel what has happened, and you'll feel how you belong to a place just by actually walking it. So who were the first Pākehā to walk in Wairarapa? Ironically, it was a man called William Deans, probably. There had probably been sealers who lived on the coast, but the first person that we know purposefully came to Wairarapa, walked to Wairarapa, was William Deans, who came round about as far as the Muka Muka Rocks, which are on the south coast, and he looked at them and he thought, shit, I'm not going around those, and he turned around and went back. Which in a way was a disaster for Wairarapa, because of course he went on to live in Christchurch at Riccarton, and if he'd come here instead, Robbie Deans would have been the Wairarapa coach, not the Christchurch, not the Canterbury coach. So what happened basically, Wairarapa was explored. And I love this term, because you read Pākehā books about early exploration of Wairarapa, and you hear about these great Pākehā explorers who came to Wairarapa, including the guy we're going to talk a little bit about, Ensign Best. But actually, all of them came with Māori guides. And almost invariably, we don't know who the Māori were. So these guys weren't explorers, they were customers. They were being taken for a walk, like you guys. They were being led on a walk around to Wairarapa. Ensign Best came round. He'd wanted to come around a couple of times, so he persuaded Te Aotearoa people from Wellington to bring him around. And they were a bit reluctant because it hadn't been that long that they'd been at war with the Wairarapa people, so they were more than a little bit concerned about coming around. So they came around the muku around just into the lower part of the lake on the western side of Lake Wairarapa, and explored around there a little bit. I hate to say this, Ra, but he recorded that his Te Aotearoa guides were really worried about coming across what he called Ngāti Kahuhuns. So
What's changed?
then the next explorers, again, these guys were all guided by Māori guides, and as I say, largely unnamed Māori guides, were Wellington surveyors from the New Zealand Company, and so they were in particular Kettle and Wills and Stokes and Childs. And you'll see monuments put up to their explorations. Well, again, as I say, they were actually following Māori tracks, and they were being guided along by Māori, so they were being taken for a ride, I guess you could say. The first real big walker, the first big Pākehā walker around Wairarapa probably was William Colenso. So most of you will know that he was a missionary, originally based in the North Auckland area, came down to the lower part of the North Island, lived largely in the Napier area, but extensively walked up and down our coast, undertaking missionary activities to Māori. And fortunately for us, he made a really good record. So we know a lot about his perambulations around the Wairarapa coast and into the towns, the kainga inside the valley as well. The next group of walkers were the first sheep farming families. So in particular, Clifford, Vavasur, Weld and Peter, who farmed down at Wharikaka. So they set a pattern that was followed by other early families like the Bidwells and others, who came around. They came around from Wellington, they walked, and they had to walk their cattle past the dreaded Muka rocks. So at the Muka Rocks, even at low tide, you still had to swim the sheep around and swim the cattle around, and at high tide it was impassable. So it was a real problem for the very early Pākehā settlers. Fortunately, that problem was solved, fortunately, if that's the right word, it was solved in 1855 when the huge earthquake that Wairarapa had lifted the Muka rocks out of the sea. And after the earthquake, you could walk around the rocks. That earthquake, by the way, it's like to scare people. So if you think of the Christchurch earthquake, and you think how big that was, the Wairarapa earthquake wasn't 5 times bigger. It wasn't 6 times bigger, it was 30 times bigger. So when that main fault line goes, you're going to have a big, big problem. So some of those early settlers were actually drovers themselves, so they drove for other people, they bought the cattle around for other people, and then ended up being able to lease a little bit of land off Māori, and then be able to set up themselves on a station. So we're thinking of people like Peter Hume, for example, down at Tawanui, down in the south of Wairarapa. He started out as a drover. So those guys all walked around. The other walkers, of course, were the very first Small Farms Association members, so the settlers in Carterton, Greytown, Masterton, Featherston. Most of those guys, when they first arrived, they walked to get here. And in Masterton's case, the first settlers arrived in 1854, and they talk about walking all the way with bringing some cattle up as well. So it was a multi-day journey. It would be at least a day to get up to the other side of the Pakuratahi on the other side of the Iwataka Range, a day to come over, then another day probably to get up to somewhere like Morrison's Bush, and then another day coming up through, following the river and up into the Masterton area. So it was a long walk. And that walking, most of the early Pākehā settlers arrived into the Wairarapa that way. Even later on, when there was a track formed across the Iwataka Range, it was a very rudimentary track, so at first it was just a walking track. Then later on you could bring bullocks and things over, but there weren't very many carriage tracks until the 1860s. So until then, most people arrived on foot. And in fact, later on, even people like the Scandinavian settlers who arrived in the 1870s, most of those walked from Wellington up to the Wairarapa. So walking carried on being a common theme. Probably the greatest group of walkers in the Wairarapa, probably the most famous group of walkers, were of course the swaggers, who wandered around the countryside in the 1880s and from there on into the 1960s. It's something that we don't really think about, but sociologically there was a reason there were so many swaggers. They were basically unsettled men, so the men who didn't have families, so they're often migrants who came out to New Zealand, so had no connections. There was a vast shortage of women, so we did some research a little while ago and found that for every 100 men in Wairarapa, in rural men especially, in the 1870s and 1880s, there were roughly 70 women. So there's going to be a big group of men who are never ever going to get married and therefore never going to become settled. And those men shifted around from station to station. The most famous of them, of course, was Russian Jack, who I'm just old enough to remember, which probably tells you more about me than Russian Jack. He walked the streets of the Wairarapa for 50 years, and further north as well. Arrived in 1912, shipwrecked in the Gisborne area, and then ended up walking around here. And so, and ended up his life here. But he wasn't the only one. There were a great number of men that walked that way. I've walked since I was a child. My parents had no car. So during my whole childhood until I left home, if I wanted to get somewhere, later on I had a bike, which was liberating. But at first, I walked to school, I walked to Sunday school, and I guess it was probably inculcated into me. I still walk, I walk every day, and so I can't stop walking. I've done a couple of, one, I guess, slightly odd walk, and another, a bit of an adventure. So during lockdown, I walked the length of every street in Masterton. And bizarrely photographed all the manhole covers. So I am the world expert on Masterton manhole covers. I know far more than anyone ever needs to know about them. The oldest ones were made in Masterton, and then later on those ones, they stopped being made in Masterton. They started to be made regionally, mainly in in Palmerston, although we did get some from Napier as well. Later they became to be made nationally, so they became made by national companies, and now they seem to be made in China. So there's a whole, and that story, of course, is replicated in everything that we buy. They were made locally, they were made regionally, then nationally, now internationally. You'd be surprised, when you've done something like that, whenever I walk through a city, I look at manhole covers. I'm always worried someone's going to report me to the police because I stop and photograph manhole covers. I get really excited when I'm walking through the square in Palmerston North and I see some manhole covers made by Valley Castings in Masterton. Masterton ones in Palmerston. Or walking through the hills of Tawa, and I found some Masterton manhole covers in Tawa. Also, probably I could report back to the police because there are at least 2 examples in Masterton of stolen manhole covers. So the manhole covers that are made by Humes, who make lots and lots of manhole covers, but they've got LHCC cast into them as well. So they originally belonged to Lower Hutt City Council. Which kind of makes you wonder, why would somebody steal manhole covers and how would they get them up to Masterton? The reason I looked at the manhole covers is actually to do with the other big walk I did. So a few years ago, I walked the length of the Ruamahana River, jumped in the mountains and walked down to the sea. And that's when what my friend Niniwa taught me began to have a lot more sense to me, because I began to understand better the way that the river is not just the braided gravel that's got occasional bits of water in it. The river is a whole lot more than that. What Māori have the term taio, which means the whole environment. And that's what the river is. It's not just the bits of water. And so it includes things like manhole covers. What's that manhole covering? It's covering water. Where did the water come from? In the case of Marston, from the Waingawa River, from Kātaran, from Kaitangata. Where would that water have gone if it wasn't taken out? Where does it go once we've done our doings in it? It goes back into the Ruamahanga. So that the Ruamahanga is actually underneath all of those manhole covers. But the Ruamahanga is a lot more than that, and it was a journey, I guess, a physical journey, but it was a much more a spiritual journey to walk the length of our land from the beautiful, pristine, clear, crystal clear water of the tops of the mountains down to where we have turned the Ruamahanga into a drain. We've channeled it, we've thrown all the crap we can think of into it, and it pushes its way back out into the sea. So a day like today, if we don't think about going out and walking today, we will never go out and think about walking today. So I'd just like to finish with a little pun for my friend Ra. Today is the sort of day where we should have some step in our spring. Yeah.